The man's name was Barlow, and his smile was a row of yellowed fence posts in a rotting jaw. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from her worn boot. "She's sturdy," Barlow said, his voice loud enough for the whole dusty street to hear. "Good hips for work, or for whelping. Your choice." Alara stood on the auction block, though it was not a real auction block. It was the wooden porch of the general store in a town that had already condemned her. She was not chattel, not legally, but the distinction felt thin as smoke. Her late husband's family had made an arrangement. They had paid Barlow a fee to see her settled, which meant disposed of. She was 20 years old, widowed, and according to the whispers that followed her like flies, she was as plain as a mud fence and twice as wide. A ripple of low laughter moved through the small crowd of men gathered. Farmers, ranchers, a few aimless drifters. They looked her over the way they might assess livestock. Checking her teeth would come next, she thought with a cold, hard knot of fury in her belly. "She don't say much," Barlow added, nudging her with a dirty elbow. "That's a blessing in a woman." The knot of fury loosened, sharpening into a single, piercing point. Her husband, a quiet man of books and maps, had loved the things she said. He had taught her to read the land, to understand the flow of water and the language of stone. He had called her mind a beautiful, uncharted territory. These men saw only the territory of her body, and they found it wanting. "I say what needs saying," Alara said, her voice low but carrying in the sudden silence. Barlow's smile faltered. He was not accustomed to the livestock speaking back. "See," he recovered, forcing a chuckle. "Spirited. Needs a firm hand." She met the eyes of the men in the crowd, one by one. She saw derision, pity, and a flat, vacant indifference. They were not buying a wife or a worker. They were witnessing a spectacle. The humiliation of the fat girl, the plain girl, the girl no one had wanted until she became an obligation. She had been an object her entire life. An object of her father's disappointment, her mother's worry, and now the town's casual cruelty. The heat of the sun beat down on her head. The dust coated the back of her throat. For a long moment, she felt nothing at all, a hollowed-out gourd rattling in the wind. Then the shame came. It was a physical thing, a hot flush that started in her chest and spread to the tips of her fingers. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the cracks of the wooden planks beneath her feet. But she did not. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and held their gazes until they, one by one, looked away. "Vuge." She found refuge in the narrow alley between the smithy and the livery. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and horse manure. It was a smell of work, of purpose. It was honest. She leaned her back against the rough brick wall, the scratch of it a welcome, grounding pain. She did not cry, not at first. The tears were a luxury she had not been able to afford for a very long time. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, her sturdy black skirt pooling around her. She drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as she could. The sounds of the street were muffled here. The laughter, the murmur of commerce, the life of the town she would never be a part of. It was in that small, stinking space that the tears finally came. They were not for the humiliation on the porch. They were for the accumulated weight of 1,000 slights, a million moments of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed. They were for her husband, whose death had left her not just alone, but unprotected in a world that had always seen her as a burden. The sobs were silent, racking her body until her throat ached. It was a deep, painful purge. When it was over, she felt empty, scoured clean. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a muddy streak on her cheek. She looked at her hands, calloused and capable. They knew how to mend a harness, how to set a splint, how to read a balance sheet. Her husband had made sure of that. She had value. She knew it, in the quiet spaces of her own mind. The world simply refused to see it. A vow formed in that emptiness. It was not a grand or eloquent thing. It was a simple, hard promise forged in the fire of her pain. Never again. Never again would she trust the word of a man who saw her as a commodity. Never again would she place her safety or her worth in the hands of another. She would rely on herself. She would be her own fortress. She would survive. Alone. Ja. A shadow fell over her. Alara flinched, pulling her knees tighter, expecting Barlow or one of the others. Mrs. Thorne. The voice was low and calm. It held no mockery. She looked up. The man was tall, built of sinew and bone rather than bulk. He was weathered, his face a landscape of sun and wind, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect so unexpected it felt like a physical blow. He was not polished. His clothes were functional, worn but clean. He looked at her not with judgment or pity, but with a quiet, assessing gaze. The way a man looks at a fence that needs mending, she thought, calculating what was required. Barlow said I'd find you here, he said. He took my money and pointed. Her heart sank. He was the one, the buyer. I am not for sale, she said, her voice raw from crying. The man nodded slowly. I know. Barlow is a vulture. I paid him to leave you be. Paid him what your husbands can offered. So he had no more claim. Alara stared at him, suspicion coiling in her gut. Kindness from a stranger was a currency she had never traded in. Why? She asked, her voice sharp. I heard what they were planning, he said simply. To sell your contract to the first man with coin, likely for the mines up north. There's no place for anyone. I have a ranch. It needs work. I need help. He was offering a job, a transaction, that she could understand. My name is Kalen. Kalen Hayes. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply waited. She appreciated that. She got to her feet on her own, brushing the dust from her skirt. The arrangement is this, he said, his gaze steady. I have a room for you. It has a lock on the inside. You'll have the key. You will be paid a fair wage for any work you do. If you wish to leave at any time, you are free to go. I'll give you a month's wages and see you to the stagecoach line myself. She searched his face for the lie, the hidden hook in this too generous bait. She found nothing but a quiet gravity. People in this town, she began, her voice trailing off. I don't give much mind to what people in this town say, he finished for her. I judge a person by what they do, not by their size or their station, or the gossip that follows them. Her vow echoed in her mind. Never again trust. I don't need your charity, she said, testing him. This is not charity, he replied, his voice firm but not unkind. My ranch is failing, Mrs. Thorne. My books are a mess. My creek is running low, and I'm losing cattle. I'm not offering you a sanctuary. I'm offering you a disaster. I need someone who can see what's broken and knows how to fix it. Barlow said you were sturdy. I'm betting he was right, just not in the way he meant. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day. He turned as if the matter was settled. My wagon is this way. She hesitated for only a moment. Her options were this man's disaster or the world's cruelty. She chose the disaster. She could understand a disaster. She followed him. The wagon was old, the horse was older. Everything about him spoke of a man holding on by a thread. As she climbed onto the hard wooden seat, her stomach rumbled, a loud, embarrassing growl. She hadn't eaten since morning. Kalen Hayes didn't smile or make a joke. He simply stopped, reached into a sack behind the seat, and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Are you hungry? He asked. It was a simple question, a human question. It was not about her appearance, her worth, her purpose. It was about a fundamental need. She could only nod, her throat tight. He handed her the bundle. Inside was a hunk of bread and a thick slice of cheese. He turned his attention back to the horse, giving her the privacy to eat without being watched, without being judged. Alara ate the bread and cheese as if it were the finest meal she had ever tasted. Each bite was a small act of defiance against the shame she was supposed to feel. Each bite was an affirmation. I am here. I am hungry. I will be fed. And for the first time, a crack appeared in the stone wall of her vow. Chug. The Hayes Ranch was nestled in a valley that should have been beautiful. The land was good, the grass was plentiful, but a pall of neglect hung over it like a low-lying fog. A gate sagged on a single hinge. Tools lay rusting where they had been dropped. The main house, though solidly built, had a weary, unkempt look. It was, as Kaelin had promised, a disaster. Alara saw it not as a mess, but as a system of failures. A series of problems waiting for solutions. Kaelin led her to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a small table, and a washstand. But it was clean, and on the inside of the door was a new, shiny brass lock. He handed her a single key. "Supper is at sundown," he said, and left her alone. The lock was real. The key was real. She turned it, and the solid click was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a promise kept, the sound of a boundary. She did not rest. Rest was a vulnerability. Work was a shield. She went to the kitchen. It was a chaotic landscape of unwashed pots, scattered utensils, and a floor that was sticky underfoot. It was the heart of the house, and its heart was failing. Methodically, without asking permission, she began to impose order. She heated water on the stove. She scrubbed the pots until the copper bottoms gleamed. She washed and dried every dish, every fork, every knife, arranging them in the cupboards with a quiet, satisfying precision. She swept and mopped the floor. This was her language. She could not make herself beautiful or charming, but she could make a space clean and functional. She could take chaos and give it structure. When Kaelin and his two young ranch hands, barely boys, came in for supper, they stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was transformed. A simple stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of onions and thyme. They said nothing. They simply washed their hands and sat at the clean table. Alara served them, then took her own plate and sat slightly apart, as was her habit. The silence was thick. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against bowls. When he was finished, Kaelin pushed his bowl back. He looked at the clean counters, the organized shelves. "Supper was good," he said. From another man, it would have been a simple pleasantry. From Kaelin Hayes, it felt like a lengthy speech. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of effort. The two young hands, who had been watching her with the same suspicious eyes as the townspeople, looked from their boss to Alara and back again. They said nothing, but the edge of their hostility had softened. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm of work. Alara brought order to the house, mended clothes, and started a small vegetable garden in a patch of neglected soil. She did not speak much, but she watched everything. She watched the way the wind moved through the valley. She watched the color of the soil after a rare rain. She watched the cattle, how they favored one pasture over another. And she watched the creek. It was the ranch's lifeline, and it was dying. A once healthy stream had dwindled to a sluggish trickle, not nearly enough to water the herd through the dry season that was coming. Kaelin and his hands had spent days upstream, clearing fallen logs and debris, but the water level did not rise. One afternoon, she found Kaelin and an older, grizzled man staring at the dry trough near the barn. The old man was Silas, the foreman, a man of even fewer words than Kaelin. "It's the source," Silas grunted. "Something's wrong at the source." "We've been all the way to the granite shelf," Kaelin said, his voice tight with frustration. "It's clear." Alara had been walking the creek bed for days, not along the bank, but in the dry, cracked mud itself. She had been looking at the stones, the sediment, the way the earth was shaped. Her husband had taught her that water has a memory, and it leaves clues. She stopped a few feet away from them, hesitating. To speak up was to draw attention. To be silent was to watch them fail. "You're looking in the wrong place," she said, her voice quiet. Both men turned to look at her. Kaelin's expression was one of surprise. Silas's was pure skepticism. "The blockage isn't in the creek," she continued, gaining a sliver of confidence. "It's under it." She walked past them, further up the dry channel. This whole valley is limestone. My husband, he had books on it. It's porous. Water carves paths through it you can't see. She stopped at a place that looked no different from any other. She pointed down. Here. The sediment changes. It's finer. That means the water is slowing down, dropping more of its load. About 20 yards upstream, there's a line of willow saplings growing where they shouldn't be. Their roots are seeking a water source that's close to the surface. She looked at Kaylin. The creek has collapsed into a sinkhole, a small one underground. The water is diverting into the limestone strata instead of flowing down the channel. Silas let out a short, disbelieving huff. Kaylin, however, was looking at her with that same assessing gaze, but this time it held a new intensity. He walked to where she pointed, knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt. He studied it, then looked upstream at the willows she had mentioned. "How do we fix it?" he asked. He wasn't asking Silas. He was asking her. The shift was seismic. "You can't dig it out by hand," she said, her mind working through the problem. "You need to collapse the sinkhole further, then seal it. There's a clay deposit on the north ridge. If you pack the hole with that clay, it will create an impermeable layer. The water will have no choice but to follow its old path." There was a long silence. The wind whispered through the dry grass. Silas walked over, spat, and looked at the ground where she had pointed. He squinted at the willows. He looked back at Alara, his weathered face unreadable. "Ha!" he said. It was the highest form of praise. Kaylin stood up. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it changed his entire face. It reached his eyes. "All right," he said, looking at Silas. "Let's get the shovels." And the dynamite he turned back to Alara. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound, undisguised impressiveness. "What else can you do, Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, the question full of genuine curiosity. It was the first time anyone had asked her that question as if they truly wanted to know the answer. "Vuge." The creek flowed again, clear and strong. The sound of it was the sound of hope returning to the valley. The change in the ranch's atmosphere was palpable. The young hands, who had watched the work with awe, now looked at Alara with a kind of reverence. They started calling her ma'am. Silas would nod to her in the mornings, a gesture of profound respect. Kaylin trusted her, not just with the house but with the ranch itself. One evening after supper he didn't leave the table. He pushed a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the polished wood towards her. "You said your husband taught you numbers," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I'm a good rancher," he said, his gaze fixed on the book. "I'm a poor businessman. Every year I end up deeper in debt to the bank in town. I sell more cattle, I work harder, and I fall further behind. It doesn't make sense. You want me to look at them? I want you to find what I'm missing," he said. For the next 3 nights, Alara lived in the world of Kaylin's finances. By the light of a kerosene lamp, she pored over years of entries. The numbers told a story just as the land had. It was a story of a slow, methodical bleed. The prices he received for his cattle were consistently just below market rate. The costs for feed and supplies were consistently just above. There were entries for wages paid to men who had never worked at the ranch. Small discrepancies easily overlooked on their own, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate sabotage. And one name appeared again and again, signing off on the supply invoices, brokering the cattle sales. A name that was supposed to be a friend, a neighbor. Sterling. Marcus Sterling. The name felt like ice in her veins. Sterling's ranch bordered Kaylin's to the east. He was a wealthy, powerful man, known for his charm and his ruthlessness. She traced the pattern back 5 years, to the year Kaylin's father had died and he had inherited the ranch. The bleed had started almost immediately. Sterling wasn't just taking advantage of a poor businessman. He was systematically draining the life from the Hayes Ranch, weakening it for an eventual cheap acquisition. She felt a cold anger on Kaylin's behalf. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. When she explained it to him, laying out the pages on the kitchen table, his face became a mask of stone. He did not speak. He just stared at the damning evidence, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The quiet of the house was broken the next afternoon by the sound of an approaching carriage. It was a fine, polished carriage, pulled by two magnificent black horses. Marcus Sterling stepped out. He was exactly as Alara had imagined. Tall, handsome, dressed in an immaculate suit. His smile was easy and confident, but his eyes were cold and watchful. He strode onto the porch as if he owned it. Kalen met him there, Silas a silent statue just behind him. Alara stood in the doorway of the house, a shadow. "Kalen, my friend," Sterling said, his voice smooth as butter. "I was in the area. Thought I'd see how you were faring." His gaze swept over the ranch, noting the full trough, the mended gate. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Then his eyes landed on Alara in the doorway. He looked her up and down, a slow, insulting appraisal. A flicker of recognition, then amusement, crossed his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I heard you'd acquired some new help. I didn't realize Barlow's stock was in such high demand." The words were a slap. He was reminding her, and Kalen, of her place, the property from the auction block. He was dismissing her as nothing more than Kalen's fat, purchased woman. Kalen took a step forward, his body rigid with a fury he was barely containing. "Her name is Mrs. Thorne," Kalen said, his voice a low growl, "and she is a guest in my house." Sterling just laughed, a soft, patronizing sound. "Of course, my apologies. One must take help where one can find it." I suppose he turned his attention back to Kalen, his tone shifting to one of mock concern. "I do hope you're not overextending yourself, Kalen. A ranch this size, it requires a certain kind of mind to manage. Easy to get in over your head." It was a veiled threat, a reminder of the financial power he held. Alara met Sterling's gaze from the doorway. He gave her a small, conspiratorial wink, as if they were both in on the same joke. The joke of Kalen's foolishness and her own insignificance. In that moment, she understood. Sterling did not see her as a threat. He saw her as a weakness, a symptom of Kalen's desperation. He was wrong. Ja. That night, the air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken violence. Kalen paced the floor like a caged animal. "I'll ride over there," he said, his voice raw. "I'll get my money back. And an apology." "He won't give you either," Alara said quietly from the table. "He'll deny everything. He'll call you a liar. He has the bank in his pocket. He has the town in his pocket. You'll be the hot-headed, failing rancher lashing out at his successful neighbor. So I do nothing? I let him bleed me dry?" "No," she said, meeting his furious gaze. "We don't do nothing. We fight, but not with fists." With this she tapped the ledger. "We gather the evidence. Quietly. We make copies. We find the men whose names he forged on the payroll. We get statements. We don't let him know that we know. We let him get comfortable. We let him make a mistake." Kalen stopped pacing. He looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable certainty in her eyes. The fury in his own began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He noticed her choice of words. "We?" he asked softly. It was the first time she had included herself in the fate of the ranch. It was no longer his disaster. It was theirs. "Yes," she said, her chin high. "We." A silent understanding passed between them. An alliance was forged, not of man and helper but of partners. Sterling, sensing a shift he couldn't identify, escalated his campaign. The attacks became more direct. Rumors began to circulate in town, ugly whispers about the fat widow who was sharing Kalen Hayes' bed, a homewrecker preying on a desperate man. The talk was designed to isolate them, to shame them. Then one of the northern wells was fouled. The water turned brackish and poisonous overnight. A sack of rock salt was found at the bottom. It was a clear act of sabotage, meant to cripple their grazing capacity. Alara saw the toll it was taking on Kalen. He grew quieter, harder. But his faith in her plan never wavered. They worked in secret, Alara compiling a book of evidence, Kalen quietly reaching out to former hands who lived in other counties. The psychological war, however, found its mark in Alara. The town's renewed judgment was a constant, grinding pressure. She had built a small, fragile sense of belonging at the ranch, and the rumors threatened to tear it down. The old voice of her own worthlessness began to whisper in her ear again. One day, in town for supplies, she overheard two women she recognized from the day of the auction. "It's a shame," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Kalen Hayes was a good man before she got her claws into him. She's a curse on that place. Dragging him down with her." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. They confirmed her deepest, most painful insecurity, that she was a burden, that she brought ruin to everything she touched. Her husband had died. Now Kalen's ranch was dying. The common denominator was her. The logic was flawed, but her shame made it feel true. That night she made a decision. She would leave. She would remove the curse. She would save Kalen from herself. She packed her few belongings into a small canvas bag. She wrote a short note, explaining the rest of the ledger, telling him where to find the evidence she had gathered. She would slip away before dawn. It was the only honorable thing to do. As she stood in her small room, bag in hand, a frantic shout shattered the night's stillness. "Fire! Fire in the barn!" She ran outside. The sky was a terrifying orange. Flames were pouring from the roof of the main barn, the one where they stored the winter hay and kept the prize bull. Kalen was already there, shouting orders, organizing a bucket brigade from the creek. Then one of the young hands, his face pale with terror, screamed, "Jimmy's still in there. He went back for the bull." Alara saw Kalen's face in the flickering firelight. She saw him look at the collapsing roof, at the irreplaceable bull, at the inferno that was consuming his future. Then he looked at the door where the boy had disappeared. There was no hesitation. He soaked a blanket in the water trough and ran toward the barn. In that moment, Alara's resolve to leave crumbled into dust. This was a man who would run into a fire to save a boy. This was a place worth fighting for. She dropped her bag in the dirt and ran to help with the bucket line. Later, after the fire was out and the boy and the bull were safe, Kalen found her by the creek, her face smudged with soot, her dress soaked. He had seen the bag she had dropped. "You were leaving," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a deep, aching hurt. "I am a curse," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I bring ruin. The townspeople are right." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You look at me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not the curse. You are the only thing holding this place together. You found the water. You found the rot in my books. You are the smartest, most capable person I have ever known." He took a ragged breath. "Do you think I haven't heard the whispers? I've been defending your name in that town for weeks. Let them talk. Their words are wind. What you do, that is stone. That is water. That is real." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pick up the bag from the dirt. He held it for a moment, then let it drop again. A final, symbolic act. "Don't you dare run away and call it honor," he said, his voice low and intense. "Stay and fight. With me." She looked up at his tired, soot-stained face, at the fierce loyalty in his eyes. "Okay," she said. "Just okay." But it was enough. The fire was the final straw. It had been set deliberately. The sheriff, a man firmly in Sterling's pocket, declared it an accident caused by a stray lantern. But Kalen and Alara knew the truth. It was Sterling's last, desperate move to force a sale. And it almost worked. The loss of the barn and the winter hay was a devastating blow. The bank called in Kalen's loan. A foreclosure hearing was set at the county seat. The hearing room was packed. The whole town had turned out for the final act of the drama. Alara saw the same faces that had watched her on the store porch, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and smug satisfaction. They were here to see Kalin Hayes finally fall. Sterling was there, sitting in the front row, looking somber and concerned. He was the picture of the supportive neighbor, there to witness his friend's sad demise. The county commissioner, a man named Davies, ran the proceeding. He was brisk and dismissive. The bank representative laid out the case. The debt was clear, the default undeniable. Foreclosure was the only option. Davies was about to bang his gavel when Kalin stood. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "I would like to present evidence that this default is the result of a deliberate, 5-year campaign of fraud and sabotage perpetrated against my ranch." A murmur went through the room. Davies looked annoyed. "This is a foreclosure hearing, Mr. Hayes, not a criminal trial," he said impatiently. "The two are linked," Kalin said, "and the evidence will be presented not by me, but by my accountant, Mrs. Alara Thorne." He sat down and looked at her. It was her stage now. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every eye in the room was on her. The fat widow. The curse. She took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room, carrying her ledger of evidence. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Commissioner Davies. "For 5 years," she began, her voice shaking only slightly, "the Hayes Ranch has been systematically defrauded." She opened her ledger. Methodically, calmly, she laid out the case. She presented the copies of the inflated supply invoices, all signed by Marcus Sterling. She showed the cattle sale receipts, all brokered by Sterling at prices well below market value. She read the names of the ghost employees, with sworn statements from men who had never worked for Kalin, but had received small payments from Sterling for the use of their names. The room grew quiet. The smug satisfaction on the faces of the townspeople was replaced by confusion, then intrigue. She presented a geological map of the valley, the one her husband had drawn years ago. This map shows the limestone strata under the Hayes property. It also shows the only reliable year-round water source in this entire region originates on his land, a source far more valuable than the grazing rights. She then unrolled a second map. "This is a proposed plan for a new railway spur line, submitted to the county last month by a holding company, a company which, after some inquiry, was found to be wholly owned by Mr. Marcus Sterling." She traced the proposed route with her finger. It ran directly through Kalin's Valley, with a planned water depot right at the source of the creek. A collective gasp went through the room. Sterling was on his feet, his charming facade gone, his face a mask of fury. "This is preposterous. Slander from a desperate man and his accounting cow," he spat, the insult echoing in the silent room. "You can't possibly believe the scribblings of this fat, dirt-smeared woman over the word of a respected community leader." It was his fatal mistake. The ugliness of the insult, so public and so venomous, hung in the air. He had revealed the black heart beneath the polished exterior. He had confirmed, with his own words, the kind of man he was, the kind of man who would cheat a friend and humiliate a woman. Alara didn't flinch. She looked directly at Sterling. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice. "I am dirt-smeared, because while you were sitting in clean offices forging documents, I was on my knees in the mud, finding the water you tried to choke off. I was sifting through the ashes of the barn you burned. And I was reading the numbers you thought no one was smart enough to understand." She turned back to the commissioner. "The final piece of evidence. The fire. The sheriff ruled it an accident. But the fire was set in the main hay storage. An accident would have been a slow smolder. This was an inferno. It required an accelerant. My husband taught me chemistry as well. The soil samples from the fire site show traces of kerosene. But more importantly, they show traces of phosphates. The same phosphates found in the fertilizer Mr. Sterling bought in bulk 2 days before the fire. A fertilizer his own ranch has no use for." She laid the signed receipt for the fertilizer on the commissioner's desk. The case was closed. Sterling stared at her, his face a picture of disbelief. He had been undone not by a punch or a gunshot, but by a quiet woman with a ledger and a command of the truth. Gee. The sheriff, his face pale, moved to stand beside Sterling. The game was up. The commissioner, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so violently, brought his gavel down. He declared a stay on the foreclosure and opened a formal investigation into Marcus Sterling. As Sterling was led from the room, his eyes locked with Alara's. They held no remorse, only pure, unadulterated hatred for the woman he had so fatally underestimated. Then, a strange sound filled the room. It started with one person, then another, clapping. The townspeople were applauding. For her, the sound was so foreign, so contrary to everything she had ever experienced in a crowd, that she felt a wave of dizziness. Kalen was beside her in an instant, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. A simple, grounding touch. He didn't say a word. He just stood with her, a silent partner in her victory. He let her have her moment. The applause was a tide, washing away the memory of the laughter on the store porch. It was not a sound of mockery, but of respect, vindication. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The land seemed different, the air lighter. The pall of failure had been lifted. That evening, they sat on the porch of the house, watching the sun set over the valley. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple. It was peaceful. Kalen held a folded document in his hand. He had been holding it for an hour, turning it over and over. Finally, he spoke. "When my father died, he left me the ranch," he said, not looking at her. "He told me the land owns you more than you own it. I never understood what he meant until now." He unfolded the paper and handed it to her. It was a deed, a legal document drawn up by a lawyer in the next county. It deeded half of the Hayes Ranch, the half with the house, the creek source, and the prime pastureland, to one Alara Thorne. She stared at it, speechless. "This is yours," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You earned it. Every acre. You saved it. You saved me." He finally turned to look at her, his winter sky eyes serious and clear. "This is not a gift, Alara. You owe me nothing. This is not a proposal of marriage. This is an acknowledgement of a fact. This is your home as much as it is mine. You are a partner in this place, in truth. This just makes it so on paper." He took a breath. "I am asking you to stay. Not because you have to, not because you owe me, but because this is where you belong. If you'll have it." She looked down at the deed in her hands. The paper was heavy, real. It was a foundation. It was a future. She thought of the vow she had made in the alley, the promise to be her own fortress. She had defended herself with her mind, her courage. And in doing so, she had found something more than a fortress. She had found a home. She looked at Kalen, at this quiet, honorable man who had seen her value when no one else had, who had given her a key, a wage, and his trust, who had run into a fire for a boy and stood by her in a hostile room. Her vow had been about survival. This was about living. "I am not staying because I have to," she said, her voice steady and sure, echoing his words back to him. "I am choosing to." A slow smile spread across Kalen's face, the real one, the one that reached his eyes. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her. He just sat with her, sharing the quiet of the evening. His hand came to rest on the arm of her chair, his knuckles lightly brushing hers. It was a small, simple contact, a beginning. Together, they watched the last of the light fade, leaving the stars to glitter over a valley that was, finally and truly, theirs.